So a lot of people may be wondering whether or not sand cats can be domesticated, simply because they look so similar to regular cats. They have a very small size and they look very cute. It's just perfectly reasonable to wonder if they can be domesticated too. So I thought I would just address this question. So I can't really answer this question without first addressing what domestication actually is. And this is where it gets a little more complicated. So there's actually a lot of misconceptions about what domestication is or what it even means. And actually, it is a very fluid term when you look at it scientifically. When you're referring to what lay people refer to as domestication, it usually just refers to animals that are kind of obviously domesticated and are very tame and very commonly kept as pets. As you'll see, there is no real stable way to define domestication other than some strong association with humans. And of course, this is one of the main criticisms I get as an exotic pet owner, that I should only keep domesticated animals. But the thing is, there is actually not really one way to determine what is domesticated. There is no line, so to speak, of when an animal becomes domesticated or when it's considered to be a wild animal. I don't even really believe that animals should be called wild when they're born into captivity, but I'll talk about that some later time. So here's how most people think about domestication. They obviously always think of dogs, because dogs are kind of, in many ways, the ultimate domesticated animal. And people are always thinking that wolves were once vicious and wild, and then we took them and maybe we found more tame wolves and we bred them until we came up with a bunch of Pomeranians and Shih Tzus and other common breeds that we know of today. There are also people who think that we stole puppies and then we raised them and they became today's domesticated dogs. And frankly, we don't really know 100% how dogs were domesticated, but the latest research actually states in a nutshell that dogs were practically domesticated before we even really started keeping them as pets, and certainly before we started selectively breeding them, before we developed the modern breeds that we see, such as Chihuahuas and Labradors and all these other breeds that look drastically different from wild wolves. So here's the thing, before we domesticated dogs, they were not like the modern wolves of today. Or so the theory goes. They were not these huge, not so friendly wolves that you see running in the wild. They were actually a lot more similar to dogs. They were very similar to modern day village dogs. And I'll make a video about this later, but I actually have a dog that is an 80%, as determined by the Embark test, she's 80% a village dog. And I didn't even know that until giving her the test. But basically, domestication is very fluid. There's many ways to domesticate an animal, and there's many ways to define domestication, because people domesticate animals for different reasons. Obviously, they domesticate them as pets, but they can domesticate them for the fur trade. They can domesticate them to pull things and for agricultural reasons. But one thing they usually have in common is that they are able to be managed by humans, or even just be around humans. So the thing with dogs is that they were kind of self-domesticated before we even thought of breeding them selectively. And the same exact situation pretty much exists for cats. In fact, we don't really selectively breed most cats in captivity, unless you have a purebred cat, as most people don't. Most people have, kind of general cat breeds that are kind of considered mutts. We just call them tabbies and whatnot. Cats usually in captivity select their own mates. So this is huge. This shows that selective breeding isn't as important as people make it out to be. Sometimes animals just happen to make really good pets just because that is the trait of the species, or even a certain individual population of animals just happen to adapt to humans just because either it's coincidence or it's evolution. They live around humans and they fulfill that niche. And so basically, certain animals that we consider to be tame, and we think that we achieve that in some way, those were actually characteristics that were already present in a species. And this is what is being said about the Russian farm fox experiment right now. Basically, it's now being said that in that experiment, the foxes were already tame, and when they started with that bottleneck population of foxes, then they just really brought out the tameness and the associated characteristics that they developed. Some of them developed like curly tails and floppy ears and things like that, although not all of them developed those characteristics. So there's many ways to domesticate an animal. Sometimes it's just finding an animal that's really suitable for living around humans, just for various factors that I just described. And then there's the other way, which people kind of erroneously thought about wolves. You can have a species that is completely inappropriate for living around humans at first. This was actually the situation with some animals that are extensively farmed today. Like red foxes that I just mentioned, they actually did not breed well in captivity at first. They had to find special ways to get them to breed. They had to give them more space and keep them in a more natural setting, so to speak, before they got the first generation. After they got the first captive bred generation, then they were able to breed them more effectively. And this is kind of consistent among many animals. You know, if you take animals out of the wild and they're not well adapted to living around humans, you're going to have animals that are going to have a lot of special needs to breed, if they breed at all. This also occurred with stoats. We ultimately chose to farm mink to produce fur in farms because stoats never really bred all that well. Stoats need a lot of special requirements in order to not have chronic stress in captivity. And while it's perfectly possible to do that, obviously in fur farms, they want to raise them in a more battery farm-like setting, and it just wasn't economically feasible. So while we can breed stoats in captivity, the mink were much better choices for fur farmers if that's your thing. So where does that leave sand cats? While sand cats in the wild do not have a strong association with humans, unlike the cats that we are familiar with, which eventually started exploiting the human niche and hunting vermin that lived around us, sand cats are pretty reclusive and they're rarely seen. They hide a lot in the sandy mountains and whatnot in the areas of which they live. They live in parts of Africa and Asia. So when looking at their natural history, basically my sand cat is very consistent with this. They did not adapt to living around humans, unfortunately. As I've said in another video, my sand cat is not tame, so to speak. It does make sense given that they really like to hide in the wild and they don't approach humans regularly. They probably don't approach humans at all. I mean, there's a video floating around showing sand cats in the wild, and it's supposed to be a big deal because they're rarely filmed. So that just goes to show you, they have no natural inclination to adapt to a human setting. So what this means is that a sand cat would have to be bred artificially to become domesticated. So essentially we would have to, first we breed them in captivity. And this alone forms kind of a selective pressure, kind of like in an evolutionary sense and a fitness sense. Basically, the animals that are best equipped for living in captivity will be more likely to breed successfully, and the animals that do not breed successfully or breed very little obviously are not going to be the animals that produce more offspring, and it just inevitably means that sand cats that are the best suited for captivity are going to produce more offspring. So just the very act of breeding sand cats in captivity, whichever individual is willing to breed, that alone kind of sets you on a path to domesticating them. An animal that is not suited for captivity probably won't breed in captivity under any conditions, or under maybe highly specialized conditions. This is not to say that just because an animal doesn't breed means it's not doing well or that it's chronically stressed or something. Some animals do require special conditions in order to be stimulated to breed. Spring hares are one. They just have weird needs when it comes to inducing them to mate in captivity. So I think they're an exception because I don't think my little guy is chronically stressed, or at least I hope he's not. But if an animal is breeding successfully in captivity, it's just a good indication that that animal is doing rather well. So that basically answers the question that this video states. Yes, sand cats can be domesticated. So the question is, to what extent can they be domesticated? Can they be just like regular cats? This again is the misconception I'm talking about. Not every animal, when it's domesticated, turns out just like another animal, and this is why people get so confused when they look at people who keep exotic pets, and then they think, you know, that's not a dog or a cat. Well, yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not the same species. Each species is going to have different characteristics of that species. If you look at a domesticated chicken, it obviously doesn't act like a domesticated cat or a domesticated dog. If you look at a domesticated cow, or even more unusual animals like domesticated skunks and things like that, they all have different characteristics. The only thing that brings them all together is that they all breed well in captivity, and humans are breeding them, and they are able to adapt successfully to captivity. That being said, there are sand cats that are a lot more tame than mine. I just got unlucky, so to speak, but that's fine. You know, I mean, I accept them for what they are. But I have talked to people who are able to cuddle with their sand cats, and their sand cats purr at them. Mine, on the other hand, is very apprehensive over everything that I do. She always watches me, and she was this way from a very young age. So as you can see in that clip, she basically acts wild, and she's been doing that since she was a kitten. She was kind of basically a miniature adult, and I had to work with her a lot, even teaching her how to eat cat food. She did not want to eat cat food at all. She only wanted to eat raw meat. But I would say at this state that she's doing okay now. She's never going to be the cuddly little cat, even though she hisses all the time, and even though she's always looking angry. I think that she's kind of just stuck in that mode. Mentally, she's just doing fine, and she acts perfectly normal. She has all of her species-specific behavior and everything. I just think that she comes from a group of sand cats that weren't the best progenitors for breeding in captivity, or maybe they just weren't that far along, because there are other sand cats that I've seen that have completely different behaviors. So basically, that's the way she is, and she's actually tame to a certain degree. She's not completely crazy, and she does let me pet her, but she does always watch me, and she doesn't really let me see her do that much, which is very different from the rest of my animals. Now, if you look at the rest of my animals, like my spotted Jeanette, it's completely different. My spotted Jeanette is nippy. I mean, he can bite you and get angry, and he has those characteristics that people say about exotic pets, making exotic pets seem like they're so awful and whatnot, but I'm perfectly fine with all of it. That's just a characteristic of a spotted Jeanette, and he actually will cuddle with me and have those attributes people consider to be pet-like, even though the word pet is also fluid and people keep pets for different reasons, and it doesn't have to mean that you have to cuddle with them or anything like that. Some of us are just perfectly fine with having unique animals and forming whatever bonds with them that we can accomplish, as long as they seem happy and you know, I get to see them, get to see a unique animal, I'm perfectly fine with it. But anyway, that's the video, and hopefully you learned something new, and I just like to put myself out here because a lot of times exotic pet owners can be kind of faceless, and people just think that they're all just evil, messed up Joe Exotic types. And I just wanted to explain that this is not always the case, and I talk about domestication a lot on my channels and my articles because it's very important to understand why it's not wrong to keep exotic pets. Exotic pets are just animals that are less popular than others. So thanks for watching.